In the following presentation, you'll learn wisdom, insight, perception, and how to carry yourself with class, albeit armor class. The Big Bad Dungeon invites you to come in, take notes, roll for initiative, and prepare to get schooled.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Dungeon School, where apparel is mandatory and learning is a free action. Today, I have the astounding privilege to be speaking with the official game designer for A24 Films, Dungeon Master for the Pardon My Take podcast, a writer, a teacher, a bard, a dragon, Dr. Timm Woods. Dr. Timm, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me, David. I don't think anyone's given me that full introduction before, and I'm honored. That's probably the best introduction I've gotten. You got dragon in there. I love it.
Well, I mean, I think starting off, I just want to know how you found games as your passion, because certainly, like, it seems as if it's become something that's become very important in your life, and I'd like to know how you found it, how you came upon it.
Absolutely. I mean, I always say I was very fortunate because I definitely grew up in a time where I think games in general were becoming really, like, for the first time entering the mainstream and stuff. I grew up with video games and I definitely loved games, and I grew up around parents who like were involved in technology. So we had like a computer that did like Warcraft 1 and stuff on my in my basement and stuff growing up, and I like loved the fantasy genre, Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, all that stuff. And at some point, I vividly remember being around 11 years old. And it was when I was going through my dad's old Spider-Man comics. Like, I'm hitting a lot of this is like Ready Player One. I'm like hitting all the tropes, I kind of feel like. But it was my dad's Spider-Man comics. There was like an ad for this game called D&D. And it just like was advertising the Monster Compendium, I think. And I'm like, wait a minute, monsters I don't know about. I always say that, at least for kids, the number one book you get them isn't the Player's Handbook or the Dungeon Master's Guide. The Monster Manual gets more people into the hobby, I think, than any other book. And I immediately was just like, my monster encyclopedias don't have anything about these particular Beholder. What's that? And I asked for my parents to get me this game. I think I even went on like the early internet of the 90s and like found a solo adventure. And I say I had the experience that probably a lot of kids in this generation, or not this generation, but the Minecraft generation, and like Legos and stuff. I think there's a mentality of like, oh, wait a minute, you can do anything with this. And I had that moment with D&D where I'm like, okay, so if they're rolling for the rat and they're trying to hit the fighter, they need to roll this number, and then they need to roll a lower number if they're trying to hit the wizard. So you could be different characters, and it doesn't have to be rats and skeletons. It could be other monsters. Wait a minute. This is an engine for telling any story you want to tell as a game. And it blew my mind. I fell in love. And I say half the reason I have the job I have is because I fell so deeply in love. I don't think there's a thing in life I'm more passionate about than this game and sharing this game with other people. It is definitely something that is my true passion, for sure.
So, when you say this game, what is your favorite game? What's I guess like your very favorite game? I know that you're someone who has a very large catalog of games that you play, but which one is the one that holds a special place in your heart?
I mean, it would be very hard for me to argue against Dungeons and Dragons because it's the number one that I grew up with. It's the one I definitely played the most, that got me into TTRPGs, and it is my bread and butter. 95% easily of the games that get requested for me professionally are Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. That being said, especially in the past few years, I've gotten to go back to what I consider kind of my roots of discovering games that I'm like passionate about. I do D&D as my work now, and I love getting to do that. But at the same time, getting to pick up, especially like what are classified traditionally as indie RPGs. That's my favorite thing to do at conventions now, is to swing by, like, see what's at the indie tables, grab a few books. And I'm past the point. I used to be like, well, if I'm not going to run it, if I there's so many games to play, if I'm not going to run it, what am I going to do learning a book of new rules? And instead, a lot of them are so bite-sized now that it is a delight just to experience them. So I got to learn Wanderhome very recently, a
Nice.
few other adventures that are games that are just like, yeah, bite size, and I see exactly what they are fulfilling the niche of, sort of. And Call of Cthulhu, I used to say was always my favorite, actually, TTRPG, because in some ways it's more atmospheric, it's more evocative. I think it's harder to run in some ways, but it's because it is in many ways just like a better. I think that the mystery horror genre is more conducive to TTRPGs than even the action adventure fantasy genre. So I think that Star Wars RPGs I love. I think they're very conducive to the TTRPG genre. Horror games like Call of Cthulhu. I've recently been going crazy with Wrath and Glory, which is the current Warhammer 40K TTRPG, and I'm just like, God, why? Like, it's so cool to see how many people are into D&D, but I am definitely at the phase where I'm just like, more different games. Let's go. I still don't see enough love for these other games that are out there, and the great companies that are trying to make these games. Obviously, we all say in the shadow of D&D is where all these games live, but at the same time, it's something I appreciate more getting to enjoy in my downtime, as it were.
I'm so glad you mentioned Wrath and Glory, because I just got into a Wrath and Glory game, and we're having. I mean, it's just a lot of fun. It's just a lot of
That
fun.
makes me so happy. It's something where I think in just the past 30 days, I like digested the whole starter set and rule book and was like, no, no, no. It's not the easiest game to pick up, but it's worth it. And the things they're doing with combat, once I understood it, I'm like, huh, like count on a war game turned into a TPRPG to kind of like almost pioneer a new kind of combat than what I had been used to. And I really, really love it.
So one of the things that I think I thought was amazing, Dr. Woods, is how you talking about incorporating it as a tool, like TTRPGs as a tool for learning. If you could take me through a little bit of that process, and how you take these games and you get people invested in these games and use it to teach them stuff. I think that's super cool.
Absolutely. I mean, this is something I could talk forever about because this was the subject of my dissertation when I did my PhD, basically, was I'm looking at these games. And I think the largest statement I would make is when you look at what even especially what teachers are saying we need teachers to be. It was when I went into like higher education, really got into the higher conversations about like, what do we need the classroom to be? What do we need teachers to be? What do we need students to be to kind of maximize not just efficiency, but like really what are classroom goals and what do we want out of our education system on a very high level working down? And I looked at like what teachers were saying, and I'm like, guys, have you heard of TTRPGs? Because the Venn diagram of what you're saying a good teacher is, and what people are saying makes a good game master, not just any game master, but a good game master. We're talking about one circle, really, would be my argument. Teaching and dungeon mastering are such similar skill sets that once you start noticing it, it's spooky, I would argue. And that is really something that then I started looking into the history of D&D. I would consider myself far from an expert on that, but at the same time, John Peterson's book Playing the World was really, I consider, the seminal text on the history of D&D. And reading that, I got to use essentially the history and observe through like, what the history of D&D had been and how it came about to kind of point to like, wait a minute, and games in general, I consider this to be true. We consider them entertainment, and that's fine. I'm not saying that that's not true, but when you look at a lot of games, maybe games in general, particularly D&D, there's a whole educational level to it. And I would argue with a lot of games, what makes them fun is the learning that's taking place already within the game. So at that point, my argument is all games have this educational underlay, whether we're recognizing it or not, because what we call fun is really best described as a manifestation of what happens when the brain is learning at its, I don't want to say optimal or most efficiently, but when it's like babies play by learning, and they learn or they play primarily in order to teach themselves more things about the world around them. They're just like picking things up, throwing them around, putting things in their mouth. Because apparently babies like want to wrap their whole face kind of around something to get they can't wrap their hands around it. So this is how they play to learn what the shape of something is. Like play is intrinsic to the learning process. So when we recognize that, then it's just a matter of what is the game teaching teaching. And Grand Theft Auto or like war games like Call of Duty, I would argue are educational. And it's also fair to say, what are they teaching? Maybe not what you want kids to learn. I think that's fair. But at the same time, they're teaching something. Even like these games that maybe we're like, oh, and I think when we talk about like the panic of like, oh, video games are encouraging violence, it's like, well, then you're admitting there is still like something's happening there that the kids are internalizing and stuff. And then I just say, you just need to design a game to teach whatever the curriculum is that you're trying to teach. And I use the example of the writing classroom in my dissertation because that's the one classroom where people were like, the biggest problem is engagement. I'm like, well, guess what? Have I got the tool for you? Games are I'm arguing educational. What I don't need to argue is the games are engaging. That's already proven. So the writing classroom is so free form in many ways that gamifying it is really easy to do. And so I use that kind of as my example of like really games are already educational, and TTRPGs in particular are such a modular game that if you're going to create a game to accommodate a set of curriculum that's maybe not as easy as like math to Math Blaster, like that's an easy transition. You want to make a game teaching math? We've been doing that since the 80s, and they've been working since the 80s, which is pretty impressive, frankly speaking. I think that when we look at what the best games are for teaching, probably it would be a TTRPG because the way it already mimics the sort of exchange in the classroom.
And Dr. Timm, you've done this around the world, right?
I'm very lucky because the first time I kind of discovered the applications of D&D, I was teaching English as a second language in Thailand, or it was first in Thailand. Yeah, they were asking me, run an after school program. We don't care what it is as long as the kids are speaking English. And I'm like, all right, then it's going to be D&D. If it's what I get to pick, cool, it's going to be D&D. And it was really successful. Then when I was teaching abroad in another place in Chile, the students, I like did a more advanced game, and the students were like, many of them didn't speak any English, and I got to watch them communicating with their students, like with the other students, like, all right. And I could literally see them being like, I want to tell this teacher that I want to hit these 3 goblins with a clustered ice blast. Like they understood all the rules. And I'm like, yes, now tell me what it is I already know what you want to do, but you've got to, and they would talk to their friends. Their friends would be like, here's how you say it to him. And then they would say it to me. And I'm like, we're doing more English in this game than we do in all of my classes in the actual classroom. It was going really well. I started trying to figure out what this would look like in an ideal setting. But I think ESL is a great example of gamification being a highly recommended strategy.
So how do you go from there to becoming a professional game master, and that becoming your full-time your full-time job? Like how did that journey go?
Absolutely. Honestly, I do always have to warn people. I think that going through teaching was very advantageous to me. People are very interested in kids getting educational opportunities that appeal to students who maybe like screens and like video games and stuff. And when I watch parents, especially parents with students who are like on the spectrum or had like special learning needs, ADHD or something like that, and they're like, they normally only love this stuff, and now they love D&D, and D&D is social. D&D has leadership skills built into it. The parents were very excited about the after school programs. There was immediately value understood. I kind of got started really working with some schools, but primarily just handing out a business card and offering to run like birthday parties and stuff. And I always tell people the funniest thing to me was I made business cards, and within a month and a half, I ran into a mom who was like, oh my God, you teach D&D? I've been looking for someone like you for 3 months. And I'm like, well, that's longer than I've had the idea to run birthday parties. So the demand existed before I even had the idea. And so that to me in a nutshell is like, yeah, okay, we it's not even just, I think it's understood in the hobby that the bottleneck is dungeon masters. Dungeon masters are scarce. We need more dungeon masters. But when you're outside the hobby, that problem gets magnified by like 20. You don't even know where to go. And then you walk into your friendly local gaming store. And honestly, if that's where you're coming from, it might not seem seem that friendly, it might seem intimidating. I think a lot of people outside the hobby are getting underserved. And that was sort of where I had the opportunity. I handed out business cards, I worked with schools, and working with parents in schools, I think was very advantageous, which also in a nutshell says how my job is different than typical dungeon mastering. Plenty of dungeon masters don't want to run games for kids, don't want to run games as special one-shot events, just like, for like a birthday party. Plenty of people don't want to run games for new players. They're like, I want my players to like know what's going on in their sheet. That's not my job. I don't run games for people who know D&D already, or I do, but most of my work is with people who are just like, I'm a wizard? What does that mean? And I'm like, don't worry. I know exactly how to like what to not tell you because it's overwhelming, and what to start with to get you like slowly into the hot bath water, as it were.
So how many games do you normally run through in a week?
In a week, I'll do about nowadays more like 5 a week. I
Okay.
used to do sometimes a lot more. I used to, when I was in my 20s, do like I'll do 3 games in one day. And now my voice can't do that. My brain can't support that. We're running a little bit slower nowadays. So I do tend to cut back. And now I'm actually offloading games onto like other game masters who I've kind of brought in as like a roster of like rotating people who go to different schools and stuff. So I'm excited to say I'm expanding in that sense, but I physically just can't run as many games as maybe I used to in my 20s. But I'll definitely, I would say on average around 5 a week. Yeah.
And are these all games that happen in person, or are these remote games?
Since COVID, my first thought, I remember, in March of 2019 was just like, oh man, I'll have to cut down my rates because I don't value online D&D as much as I do in-person D&D. I just know that it's night and day. And I really don't like to say that actually. It just is very different. But COVID did one thing for D&D, and that was made it very clear that it is valuable. It was maybe the most social thing you could do while quarantining. And then it blew up in terms of online D&D. And I would not say I love all the habits. I think that like it encouraged people to be like playing video games while doing like playing D&D and stuff. But at the same time, I'm just like, hey, more people I think than ever are playing D&D. More people than ever are okay with it being online. And if anything, I'm like, I'm sorry, everyone. My rates are in fact not going down. My rates are staying exactly the same. They might even go up because I actually early on fell into the trap of being like, oh, I don't need to commute. I can run way more games back to back, and I'll just sit on my couch all day running D&D. And then when I finish, I'll continue to sit on my couch. And like I was doing all the classic work from home mistakes people were making at that time. And now I would say more than 50% of my games are online because a lot of my consistent groups kind of scattered from New York City and went to other places and never didn't necessarily reconvene again physically. Just there's a lot of logistics to work around. I'm sometimes running games for people in different time zones and stuff, or just outside the New York area. With the Pardon My Take podcast, I get a lot of people across the states who will either fly me out to them for special events or who will just run a Zoom game more likely.
So I wanted to ask you 100% how you break apart a module when you run it, and how you digest all of that information, because your ability to retain information is incredible.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Honestly, that I take that to heart because that's something where it's like it's important skill for Dungeon Master, and I don't know that I'm always doing it. So I'll say this: I love modules because number one, modules have been vetted. I always think back to like a forum post I saw like back in the early 90s or something, in like the early days of D&D forums, where somebody was like, I made a 7-layer dungeon with a cool waterfall going down the middle, and the party just sailed a boat down the waterfall, and we're like, we're in the lowest level of the dungeon. It's like, guess what? I haven't even designed one room of the lowest level of the dungeon, guys. Thanks a lot. And it's just those. I joke that that's a literal plot hole. And when you design your own adventure, you don't see the plot holes until sometimes it's too late, and you have to say, hey, everyone, guess what? The magically going down the waterfall isn't going to work. A wizard did it. I need to come up with, honestly, I consider that the best way to handle something like that is just be like, hey, listen, everyone, I understand that maybe you're even like, we got one over on the Dungeon Master. What I'm telling you is I can't provide you a good session if we do this idea. And I'm so sorry to nerf like this great improv that you're doing. But if I'm being honest, I think we should go in through the front entrance of the dungeon, and that will be more fun for everyone. So I love modules because they've been vetted by groups of players for major plot holes, major like, why wouldn't we just do this? And then there's no quest. It's like, oh snap. So I love to use the one modules, but I almost never use a module as written. Part of why I like the modules also is because I can't just improvise a different game for every single group. That would be crazy. Most of the time, if it's a group's first game and I'm only going to see them once for one bachelor party or birthday or something like that, I am going to have a canned adventure. And that adventure is going to be the same level 2 adventure that I'm going to run for every other one shot up until the moment when I run it on the podcast. Once I run it on the podcast, I have to retire that introductory adventure. So that's sort of the lifespan of modules as I run them. For a long time, I would run Lost Mines of Phandelver, classic beginner box adventure. Then I run it on the podcast, and that actually is something I do for me as well, because retiring an adventure is something I kind of need to do. Otherwise, it starts to get, after like 6 months, it's pretty stale and boring at that point. A year, definitely. I'm like, I need a new adventure at this point. And I've actually started homebrewing some of my own now, but like Lost Mines of Phandelver, I ran that one to death and then got to retire it on the podcast. Then I switched to Sunless Citadel, did that for about 6 months, and then ran it on the podcast, retired it. I did Forge of Fury. Again, these are some classic adventures that I just know or have been so popular over multiple editions that like I can run these and people are going to have a good time because it's a good sample of D&D. But what I always have to do is take those and then essentially break all the bones and then put them together in such a way that that adventure fits in 3 hours, which is unrecognizable at that point to the original adventure. Very much, if you watch how I run Forge of Fury, there's about 4 rooms in that dungeon in all, maybe 5. I think Forge of Fury was one of the larger ones. Sunless Citadel, I do about 3 or 4 rooms of Sunless Citadel, and it's just hitting the highlights of what that adventure is. So it's very much just like hitting the major notes of these adventures. But these adventures are written in such a way where it was like, we want to have a little bit of role playing, a little bit of exploration, a little bit of combat. And it's like, you guys are hitting the 3 pillars for me. So I'm going to use this module, and it's going to usually go very, very well as a result.
So, you were saying like 3 hours is the number. So how did you settle on 3 hours being the magic number for running these games?
Honestly, early on, I had such new players that to them, they didn't have a perspective on how much time they needed. I make the joke that on the podcast, they interviewed me for about, I think, 30 minutes. And then in the last 5 minutes of the interview, they were like, could we play D&D right now? And I was like, but sure, I guess. Like, I don't know. And I handed out pre-made character sheets because I had them. I was just like, you're the barbarian, you're the wizard. Like, there you go. And then I was like, there's a goblin in the trees. He's watching you. And they're like, Hank's working with the goblin. I'm like, he's definitely not, though. I can tell you he's not. And like, no, he definitely is. We're gonna kill Hank, and then we're gonna kill each other. And then Big Cat was like, I won. I killed everybody. I won D&D. And you hear me on the podcast being like, I guess from a certain point of view you did. And everyone was dying laughing, having the best time, including me, because they knew they were goofing off. They knew this was not actually D&D. They even knew there was a story that they weren't pursuing. And I left being like, wait a minute, those guys are geniuses. They knew they had 5 minutes, and they did the most entertaining thing you could do in 5 minutes, which was goof off, kill each other, and like kind of pretend you're playing D&D. And then I kept coming back, and they kept doing more and more like proper D&D, but also this very tongue-in-cheek, like classic stuff, like, oh, this guy has a quest for us, we're gonna kill him and skin him. And I'm like, classic D&D right there. You guys don't even know, but this is actually, oh, we're going to seduce the dragon. Tim, have you ever had anyone seduce the dragon? I'm like, please, guys. You've seen Game of Thrones. Dragons are sexy as hell. You think people aren't seducing them all the time? And so I actually give them credit that they did an amazing job running D&D, but like, or just playing D&D. But I landed on 3 hours because so many of the clients would reach out to me and not really have a sense of how long a game needed to be. And they were very skeptical that people would want to sit down for more than an hour and a half. And I'm like, listen, Give me a minimum of 2 hours. And I promise you, no one will get bored in 2 hours. And eventually I was able to convince people to mostly go with 3 hours. 3 hours was a compromise between some groups who wanted to do less, where I'm like, you don't, I'm promising you, even the little kids. And they sat down for 3 whole hours. And I'm like, hey, that's D&D. The time flies and you don't even notice it's going by. Versus the other groups would be like, so we want to book you for 7 hours. And I'm like, hey, until I've met you, I'm not doing 7. And like just the fact that you can sit down for 6 hours of D&D, the level of expectation, I'm like, you might be a group. I always say groups that are hardcore, you don't need a professional DM. You do not need me. If you have a game master already, do your thing. I'm probably not going to be able to provide your thing. Like what you do every week, that might be very different from what I'm used to running. And so I really stick with 3 hours just because I consider that like a perfect TV episode of D&D kind of. And nowadays I'm kind of like, actually go longer, because I actually think 4 hours is an ideal number as well for a group that's going to actually be like talking strategy and stuff and being like, no, 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 don't attack that guy. Actually go for this guy. I'm like, you guys want 4 or 5 hours even, because you're really sinking your teeth into this. Usually a group like that, though, will book me for a second game. So I don't feel like bad if I feel like they're not getting everything that they wanted out of the first 3 hours. I'm like, you guys clearly like D&D. We'll come back another time and maybe do a longer session, perhaps.
So with that kind of like with that plan in mind, how do you approach combat encounters? How do you run your combats? And do you take that philosophy with you to other games that are not D&D?
Yes, definitely. All my philosophy, every other TTRPG I play is informed by how I run D&D, because at this point, my version of D&D is very much just like jazz to a certain level. It's like, yeah, I'm using the rules, but I also know how stealth works in my game, how I do resting, stuff that it's left a little more ambiguous. I'm like, no, I know how to make, I played third edition. I know how to make this stuff a little more concrete and satisfying in some ways, whereas it's left a little more abstract for, I consider more for the beginner DMs and stuff. So those inform how I run other TTRPGs, and other TTRPGs definitely inform how I run D&D. All when I see a good technique in a TTRPG that I can bring to another game, they all inform each other and kind of become almost like one lingo. But sorry, your question you had asked was, I'm just trying to remember now.
I mean, just I guess like running. I think drilling down, the thing that I really would like to know is like what is your most powerful full technique? If our viewers had one thing that they could take away from, I guess like all of the time that you've put into running the games, what's the one thing that you would suggest that they mastered to have more fun games?
I definitely remember what I was thinking of saying. The thing especially how I like do combat, you had mentioned.
Yeah.
One thing I do that is very unusual in a 3 hour game, especially when it's their first 3 hour game, no one's ever acting out of initiative. You start in town, and I even give you a hint like you could leave now and get to the exciting part, which is the dungeon. There's a dragon attacking the town. Clearly, it's in the mountains over there. We know that that's where the quest is. But you're starting in the village. And if you think you need resources or information, that might be very helpful. Invariably, someone suggests, can we go to the tavern? I'm like, not only is that fun, it's a great source of information. Absolutely. Everyone goes to the tavern first. It's a great idea. Just logically, like they've seen enough, and it tells me like what kind of fantasy stuff they know about. But those first turns in town happen in initiative, in the sense that I'm not worrying about movement speed or anything like that. But I'm like, cool, you get one roll to persuade them. And then as a bonus action, I'll let you like buy drinks or like talk to this other person real quick and get one other piece of information or something like that. But then once you've done a very abstractly labeled action and bonus action, usually like 1 or 2 dice rolls, then we are, oh, your turn's over. And there's no like, oh, but can I do 3 more things? We're out of initiative. It's like, no, no. The point is, I want the loudest, most talkative person to only get to talk as much as everybody else. And I want the quietest person to have to talk as much as everybody else. And invariably, the loudest person is very often like thinking, oh, no one else has any good ideas players, but me, the person who has played the game before. So it's my responsibility to actually kind of like do 3 times as many actions as everybody else. And meanwhile, when we get to the quietest person's turn in my plan, suddenly the quietest person is like, I've been waiting for my moment, actually. And I was wondering, would I, as a wizard, be able to do this? And I'm like, guess what? You were paying attention to your character sheet. That's exactly how that works. And yes, you can. And invariably, I want to get those quieter people talking. And I mean, the talkative people are very often already having fun. And I always say the people who know the game the best, who are the most exciting, who are the most talkative, if I can enroll the quiet, reluctant people, the people who are like, I'm just doing this to humor my like a lot of the times it'll be someone's wife is in the game, like, but I'm not really. I'm like, hey, have you ever seen Lord of the Rings? They're like, oh, I love Lord of the Rings. I'm like, you're not any less of a D&D player than anybody else here, and I'm going to prove it to you that you are very much a part of this table and just as valuable at this table. And any ideas you have, we're just going to yes and those for sure. And suddenly that quieter person, more reluctant, if I can enroll them, then the excited person is going to be having even more fun. It's a phenomenon I love to see, where the one person's like, they haven't played D&D, so Tim, don't worry, I'll help them. I'm like, they don't need help. They've seen Lord of the Rings. What else do you need? Literally, there's nothing else that you need. And so you've read one fantasy book ever in your life, dude, you're done. You're done. You're just as much a veteran as like this second edition player. And it's a little bit of a BS, but like I'm trying to get them comfortable. And then when that person sees them all get comfortable, they're having more fun than if they had tried to like lead the group into D&D. They're just like, wow, like I never knew that my friend over here would be so good at playing a dwarven fighter or something like that. And they love seeing like everybody kind of come together in that respect. So keeping people in initiative, that's something where it's probably very controversial in some games, but I'm like, it's a great way to learn the turn taking aspect of D&D kind of.
So do you run any longer term campaigns? Like, or what's your currently your longest running campaign?
I would say 50% of my games are just one shots or like quick games, but I definitely run 50% of my games are weekly or bi-weekly campaigns. I'm proud to say that as of like, I really only finished and by finish, I mean doing the dream, which is we started at level 1, we got to level 20, and we wrapped up the game fighting a boss at level 20. Like, no adventures actually do that, but like you can beef them up and you can add in side quests and stuff. I around 2020 finished my first level 20 campaign. And since then, I think I've finished about 5 more campaigns at level 20. I've run the Tyranny of Dragons campaign to completion, I think 3 or even 4 times. I ran Storm King's Thunder to completion once, and I ran Tomb of Annihilation to completion once. We kind of ended around level 17 there. And feel like one other campaign I got to completion, but one group we just did custom campaigns. I ran an evil campaign to completion, and they became the villains of the world, conquered the world, and now in subsequent campaigns have been trying to fight these villain characters. So it's been very exciting to get to actually complete campaigns. I think for a long time I would just sort of like do something I think is common, where they would just get long, like stretch out longer and longer each level, because it's like there's a level of intimidation to I wrapped up a 5-year campaign, and I was having a lot of anxiety on like, because I knew the group wasn't going to come back for a second campaign. So I'm like, I need to send them out right. And I'm not sure I can do that. It's I heard a TV show writer describing it as like, you have to hook them in the first episode, and then the final episode has to be this sort of weird breakup where it's like, I'm leaving, but it's okay. And it's just like, wow, it's very heavy to wrap up a campaign and to make it feel satisfying. I don't think the rules of D&D in terms of combat support the idea of an epic final boss battle in the way we would hope. But I have managed to run what I consider some successful final boss battles, mainly in spite of how the rules actually play out, I kind of feel like. But yeah.
So I mean, in designing those encounters, I think I mean, how did you become the lead designer for A24 films? Like, how'd that process work, and what was your inspiration for the mechanics in the game you developed for them?
Absolutely. So that was actually a very interesting kind of experience because they reached out to me and my fear was they were creating the movie The Green Knight, which was very exciting. I knew the legend of the Green Knight. My fear is like, oh my God, these guys think I'm an expert on the Green Knight. Weirdly enough, I'm not an expert. I did take a class on medieval literature, had to read like the Tolkien translation of it and stuff. And so I was informed pretty well on like what the premise of this movie was, and even kind of understood how they were putting an interesting twist on it for the sake of the movie, creating this almost like immersive fantasy world and aesthetic that I simply loved about that movie. I was very lucky to kind of get to see it in some of its earlier forms, and I really liked the whole movie. But they brought me in and were like, we want to do a promotional product. And immediately what was nice was I'm in the business enough that I could kind of be like, all right, so you could make a 300-page rule book, which is what a lot of TTRPGs are. But what you want is this. And I had brought in about 5 different beginner boxes, slid them around the table, let them open them up, take a look, see the pre-made characters, like Call of Cthulhu, the Stranger Things D&D box set, the regular D&D starter set, like just examples of these products that are like, they take up a different amount of shelf space. Like, it's very obvious that when you want a promotional product, you don't actually want to go through a 300-page rule book. What you want is more like a beginner box. And immediately they were like, yes, this guy gets it. This is the exact kind of thing we want. I'm like, 100%. Now, designing the rules of this game, the movie itself informed me that like this movie doesn't give a care about, well, a halberd is very different than a longsword and they're used in very different situations. And so therefore, and I'm like, okay, so in this game, almost like the first thing I set down pen to paper was weapons will not have any differences in this game because combat is not important to the story of the Green Knight. In fact, the story of the Green Knight is all about how combat doesn't matter, like how we think combat is important and it is not. So it's very much like we want to start with what we're not doing. And what we're not doing is setting up a nuanced, realistic account of medieval combat, which is what so many TTRPGs like think like, oh, we need to have this if we're doing a fantasy RPG. It's got to focus on weapons and armor, and it's got to have a nuanced combat. I'm like, combat it's going to be one of those RPGs where combat is a single dice roll in the same way negotiating with someone is a single dice roll, doing any kind of magic is going to be a single dice roll. We're going to have one resolution mechanic for everything from ordering someone to basket weaving to everything else. It's going to be one of those elegant, simple RPGs because the movie was not conducive to this like, oh, very complicated, very niche nuance. And when I watched the movie enough times, I was like, this movie is all about one thing: honor versus dishonor. That's the binary. It is, and everything about like whether you live or die is simply informed by whether you're honorable or dishonorable. So I'm like, okay, so the game's got to be all hinged around this idea of, did you take an honorable action or did you not? So I built the game from the ground up as to being the most important. I almost took how in D&D you have this complex rule set, and then what ends up happening in the game is interpersonal stuff that is then resolved using the complex rule set. But often what the interpersonal stuff is what you focus on, and it'll be things like a rogue and a paladin disagreeing on how to approach a situation. And I was like, whoa, that dynamic is what this whole game is going to be about. We're going to have a bunch of rogues and we're going to have a bunch of paladins. And, not literally, but like you could have someone who's a knight in the game who acts more roguish versus more paladin-like. But that's the binary, essentially. Like, not more magical or more fighty, not more like good or evil, not more like powerful or weak, or successful or not successful. It's just, are you more like a rogue or are you more like a paladin? Are you dishonorable or are you honorable? And then trying to figure out interesting mechanics of like, how can I use the rules to incentivize a dishonorable action, even though a dishonorable action is essentially taking you down the only scale that we have, which is just honor to dishonor. So yes, you would never, you're trying to avoid going into dishonor, but I want dishonor to be tempting. And I just built a bunch of mechanics and things built around the idea of, yes, sometimes you have to take a dishonorable, or you are encouraged to risk a dishonorable action and hope it pays off in the long run. Because seeing the movie, I was like, this is a lot of the dynamic. What is exciting about this movie isn't, is he really going to live or die? Ironically, he's going on a quest in order to die. So we can't say survival is the important mechanic. Giving up is the important mechanic, and succumbing to dishonor. And using Wrath and Glory as an example, you could argue that living and dying is not as important as that corruption meter. So it's like I was designing a game where it was all about like living and dying is moot. The corruption meter is everything and will determine whether you win or lose at the end of the day. You might literally like, I'm dead, but I won the game, versus I beat the Green Knight in single combat and I lost the game. And kind of then inviting that complexity and nuance to then inform the story as well as the mechanics, if that makes sense.
100%. All right. So, I've been very, very grateful and thankful over the last couple of years. There's been such incredible growth within the TTRPG space across social media and a number of different platforms. Where would you like to see TTRPGs in the next 5 years? Like, what would, if you could future cast or hope for this industry, what would you like to happen?
Wow, I think that I used to say to this, I want it to be even more mainstream. And at this point, I don't even feel the need to express that desire, because it's happening, and it's happening whether I like it or not. And it's happening like it is just on a trajectory that cannot be stopped at this point. And now I'm kind of like, because I'm getting my wish, I kind of get to sit on the fence and be like, okay, there's pros and cons to being mainstream. I can recognize that. I think it is almost all pros, because uniquely with D&D, like if you don't like current D&D, guess what exists? Old D&D. And it exists in every form you could imagine it. Even I'd make the argument that if you look for second edition or first edition D&D today, you're more likely to find it than in the 80s. And obviously not nearly as much as fifth edition D&D, but still, I would argue that compared to when we had to write newspaper art, like advertisements to find other wargaming players and stuff, you can find old school, like ruthless, whatever you're looking for. There's more of it now today than there was in the 80s and 90s. So I can't really say, oh, the version of D&D that I like might go away, because yes, there are versions of D&D that everyone's got their own game. At every table, it's a different game. And yes, at some tables, there is a game arising that is not my type of game, maybe, but I'm never going to lose out on the opportunity to run and play my type of game. I don't believe that if things are shrinking up even as things are growing. I think it's just all growing, and it's growing in disproportionate ways, but I think that the hobby's just continuing to grow. I have no feeling that like, okay, I want other TTRPGs more. And I think I'm getting that. As D&D grows, I don't have any experience that any other game is losing. They're just not growing maybe in proportion to D&D. You can make that argument, and that they should be growing more in proportion. That maybe something's happening there, but no game is shrinking as to the debt because D&D is absorbing, or some other play style is absorbing the play style or game that I like. So my desire would be in the future, I hope we get more. I hope other I hope as it grows more mainstream, it fractalizes in the way mainstream things do. So it's not just like, do you watch live streams? Do you watch Critical Role? Do you watch live streams? It's, I think you watch, I can assume, I can walk up to you and be like, you watch D&D live streams. What D&D live streams do you watch? I can tell you like TTRPGs. What TTRPGs do you like? And I would love to, get more people playing other games like Wrath and Glory, Call of Cthulhu. And I think as time goes on, we will see more of that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Woods. It's been so incredible talking
It's been
with
an
you
honor.
today. Where can the people that watch our show, where can they find you? If you have things to promote, like what could we shout to the, I guess, like to out in the world that we should keep an eye out for?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm Timm with 2M's Woods.com is my website. And I'm Timm with 2M's Woods on all of my social media. Please follow. That's where you'll see all the updates on like different games I'm running and stuff. Right now, I'm very excited that if you're in the New York area and doing any game mastering, especially with students, I am right now looking for other game masters. So feel free to reach out to me if that's something that you'd be interested in doing. Other than that, I'll be at PAX Unplugged. I'll be definitely running more games, hopefully with part of my take this January. Looking forward to that, and definitely just creating more content, hopefully in the future.
Heck yeah. All right. And
Absolutely.